Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me, Centre for Fiction. And thank you everybody for coming. I'm so delighted to see you all here on this horribly cold night, so much gratitude. As some of you may know, this book began with an article that I wrote for The New Yorker about 3 years ago, in which I explored I tried to track down a quote by George Eliot, or that was often attributed to George Eliot, which is, "It's never too late to be what you might have been." And it struck me that this quote had, just didn't sound at all like anything George Eliot would say, and it certainly didn't sound like the core message of Middlemarch, which is all about how it is too late to do many things, and it becomes too late for all kinds of things. So I tried to track down that quote. I didn't manage to find out whether George Eliot had said it or not. But in that pursuit, I decided that there was a book worth writing about things that George Eliot had said. And initially I'd had the idea that I might find, a dozen or 20 things that George Eliot had said that I could then write sort of essays about. I quickly decided this wasn't a good idea because, Middlemarch is 900 pages long because it needs to be 900 pages long. And excerpting her and boiling her down is something that, as I write in my book, has been tried unsuccessfully before. There was a character called Alexander Mead who published an excruciating volume called The Wit, Wisdom and Tender Sayings of George Eliot. It's appalling. Anyway, what I decided to do was a kind of combination of what I ended up doing is a combination of biography of George Eliot and literary criticism of Middlemarch with other novels cunningly brought in, and memoir of my life reading this book, which I first read when I was 17, before taking the exams to enter university, and have read roughly every 5 years or so since, although not on a strict schedule, because I wasn't clever enough at 17 to think that I might write a book when I was 45. Anyway, I'm going to read you a little section from near the beginning of the book, which is about George Eliot in New York. She never came here, but there is a notebook that belonged to her that she was writing in around the time that she wrote Middlemarch, that's at the New York Public Library. And I went there to look at it, and this is what I found. So here I was, a student of sorts, back in an imposing library after a quarter-century's absence. I took my seat at a carrel opposite a young man who was bending over a work by E.M. Forster, and after a few minutes, the librarian returned with a leather-bound volume the size of a slender paperback, which she settled into a bookrest. I opened to the first page, and as I did so, I became vaguely aware of a slight scent in the air that was at once out of place and oddly familiar, the smell of a spent hearth. For a moment I wondered if there could be a fireplace in the adjoining room, a silly thought quickly dismissed. But then it dawned on me that the smell was coming from the notebook itself. Glancing at the young man reading his Forster, I inclined towards the notebook and surreptitiously inhaled. There was something there beyond the usual mustiness of an old, infrequently opened book, I was sure, something that smelled like the lingering trace of a fire burning in a long-cooled grate. Perhaps, I quickly said to myself, one of the notebook's previous owners had shelved it near a fireplace. Since George Eliot's death, it had passed through many hands. Or maybe the smell wasn't smoke at all. Perhaps it was just the aging pages decaying, surrendering infinitesimal fragments to the atmosphere every time they were opened. Still, there the smell was. And maybe, just maybe, the book had absorbed molecules of smoke from a fireplace at the Priory, the house in St John's Wood, London, that George Eliot bought in 1863, and in which she lived with George Henry Lewis, the exuberant critic and writer whom she spoke of as her husband, despite the fact that he remained legally married to somebody else. Perhaps the notebook, inscribed by George Eliot's hand and containing a record of her thought and mind, had also been imbued with a trace of her material world, and could lead me back there. I'm just jumping ahead here. After a while, then I look at the notebook. After a while, I closed the notebook. But before I left, I took one more look around the reading room. In a corner stood a small desk that had once belonged to Charles Dickens, Eliot's near contemporary. I thought about his wildly popular American tours, draining but profitable excursions into celebrity that were the sort of thing Eliot avoided completely. She never travelled to America as a literary celebrity or otherwise, though in 1872, when she was in the midst of Middlemarch, an acquaintance from New England urged her to visit. She declined, writing, "Boston I always imagined to be a delightful place to go straight to and come straight back from, but the Atlantic is too wide for that." I've crossed the wide Atlantic many times, and it never gets any easier. In my early 20s, I went home to visit my parents once a year or so, and they would come to see me. In my 30s, I would stop off for a day or two in England en route to or from an assignment somewhere more extraordinary, Paris, Mumbai, Tokyo, feeling jet-lagged and glamorous. And then, as my parents became elderly and their lives constricted, I went back more often, for walks with my mother that would be filled with accounts of doctor's visits, and dinners at which my father would pour Rioja with an increasingly shaky hand. 5 days here, a week or two there, I did not want to stop and count the meagre total. When I first left England as a young woman, I didn't consider that there would be a finite and unknowable number of times I would return. Eventually, though, each goodbye came to be freighted with the possibility that it might be the last. Upon Dickens's desk was a flower in a vase and a calendar set to the date of his death, June 9th, 1870. In the years Eliot lived with Lewis, she came to know Dickens socially, and he'd been to lunch at the Priory not long before his death. "I thought him looking dreadfully shattered then," she wrote in a letter afterward. Dickens was a famous writer before she even became a novelist, and he had been an early admirer of the mysterious new author who went by the pseudonym of George Eliot. When Scenes of Clerical Life, her first work of fiction, was published in 1858, Dickens astutely wrote to the author via the book's publisher, John Blackwood, with the sly observation, "If they originated with no woman, I believe that no man ever before had the art of making himself mentally so like a woman since the world began." Eliot's identity was revealed after the publication of her first novel, Adam Bede, in 1859. This time, Dickens wrote to her in person and offered praise in terms that would thrill any writer. "Adam Bede has taken its place among the actual experiences and endurances of my life," he wrote. I left Dickens's desk and walked through the library's marble corridors and emerged on 42nd Street. I turned into Bryant Park and claimed a chair on a gravel path under one of the towering London plane trees, a species named for the city of my birth, growing in the city I had chosen. I thought about Eliot's notebook and of what it suggested about the germination and the growth of Middlemarch. I considered, too, how aptly Dickens had identified the strange potency of a great book, the way a book can insert itself into a reader's own history, into a reader's own life story, until it's hard to know what one would be without it. Reading is sometimes thought of as a form of escapism, and it's a common turn of phrase to speak of getting lost in a book. But a book can also be where one finds oneself, and when a reader is grasped and held by a book, reading does not feel like an escape from life, so much as it feels like an urgent, crucial dimension of life itself. There are books that seem to comprehend us just as much as we understand them, or even more. There are books that grow with the reader as the reader grows, like a graft to a tree. This kind of book becomes part of our own experience and part of our own endurance. It might lead us back to the library in midlife, looking for something that eluded us before. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was lovely. A lovely section to read. And, I just think it's just reading your book. This is something that has occurred to me before, but I think that because your experience with Middlemarch over the course of your life has resulted in such a profound experience in the way in which you felt that it shaped your character. I mean, you write, actually, I have grown up with George Eliot. I think Middlemarch has disciplined my character. You talk about it, it's one of the frictions of your life. Frictions and discipline, I mean, it's this very, it's a kind of fascinating idea, this, that essentially something imaginary forms you. So I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does. I mean, you know, those words, the friction of life, and it disciplining my character, come from something that George Eliot said when asked. She was speaking to a friend and said, of course, you can't tell the young what to do. Essentially, she was saying, you know, they need the actual experience of life, the friction of life, to discipline the character. And I think that what I realized really writing this book was that, or what gave me the confidence to write it perhaps, was the sense that this book is part of my life. It is not a thing that I've done occasionally, sort of in the evenings, reading as a separate thing from the rest of my life that I'm living. I've read it so much that it has become part of who I am. I don't know exactly who I would be without it. I might not be that different, but I would be different. It lives in my head as a point of reference for thinking about people I meet, or things I read, or acts I make myself, things I do, things I say, things I write. So, you know, it's not the only book I care about. It's not the only book I've ever read, but it does live with me. And I, you know, it's funny, this idea of, but it's a fictional work, so how can it matter so much? But the characters in Middlemarch they're real people. You know, they're not, I mean, they are fictional characters, but they also, over the years, have accrued such weight through so many, you know, millions of people reading them, that they exist in some sense, even if they were never born and never really lived. They exist.
They're almost, and there is that odd thing that happens where they almost become types, but they were never types. They've only become types because they were so fully personified in their creation, that so a kind of, you know, you'll see somebody, Casabon, you know, right, sort of either disparaging or complimentary, they have come to stand for. Something rather almost iconic.
They have, although less than other novelists. I mean, much less than Dickens's characters do, for example, because those are less. You know, often those characters are more caricatured,
right?
And so they can be, and they're types to begin with, I suppose. But yes, these characters that live in this novel, you know, we all know people that are like that. Hopefully we know more Will Ladislaws than Edward Casaubon's, but maybe not.
We know a few Mrs. Cadwallader.
Oh, we all know. We all have a little bit of Mrs. Cadwallader in us too, I'm sure.
Well, I wonder, you very much have a sense of what something that you just said before you answered the question about having lived it, and that it wasn't a separate thing. I wonder, just from the point of view of writing it, it reads as if it were written with ease. I mean, nothing is written with ease, really, but it just seemed that it was almost thrilling for you to find this material and be able to articulate it.
It was written with ease. I mean, not ease. No. There's no such thing as you say, no such thing as writing with ease. But it was written with joy, and it was written with pleasure, and and it was easy to write. It wasn't. It was shockingly easy. I mean, as a, you know, not easy to figure out what I was going to put in it, not easy to do all the research, that kind of thing. But the sitting down and writing the words was the most blissful writing experience I've ever had. It was you know, things were just flowing in a way that I've never experienced.
And it's very different than anything you've ever written before, too, right? And
I should have been doing it all along.
Certainly more personal than anything you've ever written. And I wonder, there was no difficulty in that?
Well, once I had, as Americans would say, given myself permission to write about myself, which is not, something that probably maybe your country people have an even harder time with than mine. I'm not sure. We could argue about that. But once I wrote the piece for the New Yorker, and the first draft of the piece that I did for the New Yorker began with a description of George Eliot's childhood home, and then it sort of went into talking about my long-lived relationship with this book. But it began with her, and when I handed it in to my editor said to me, you need to begin with you. He said, you only get one chance to write this kind of a piece. You've got to do it properly, and we've really got to be with you. So having been told that, having been given actually literally permission by one important person, I went away and did it, and that was quite hard, because you sit there writing it thinking, nobody cares, nobody wants to know about my childhood, and but then I wrote the piece, and the response to that New Yorker piece was unlike anything I'd ever received from anything I'd ever written. There were people who had read Middlemarch or wrote to me and said how it had affected them to read about what I'd done, and or people who hadn't read Middlemarch but understood that I was saying something about what the relationship is or can be between a reader and a book. And so I was very moved to discover that I had touched people in that way, and then I thought that gave me the confidence to write the rest of it. I must tell you, I just was in Canada last week, and about 75% of the interviewers there at some point in the interview, in some way or another, asked me the question, was there ever a moment where you thought you shouldn't have written this book? Because they were, was there ever a moment where you thought, who are you to be writing this book?
To set yourself next to George Eliot.
Yeah, and it was a very Canadian question. I mean, or at least nobody in America had thought to ask me.
A colonial question, maybe, I think.
Possibly,
Sort of, who do you think you are?
Well,
yes, but actually, that's one of the more charming things about the book, is that you don't set yourself next to George Eliot really at all, although there are these uncanny, there's no other word for it, completely uncanny coincidences that, for example, Rebecca is married to a man named George, and when she married him rather later in life, as George Eliot married Lewis, your George had 3 sons, so you had 3 stepsons, just as George Eliot
did, yeah, and they were the same age. The children did not have the same names. That's the one thing that was different. But 3 boys, yeah. And so far, I've not packed the 2 younger ones off to some dreadful colonial adventure, but it's crossed my mind once or twice. I loved them. There were moments where it felt that felt well. There are similarities. There were recognitions I had with her life and mine. She moved from a provincial town to a big city to become a journalist, as did I. But so did lots of other people. I mean, probably some people here did something like that. That's not so unusual. But yeah, the thing with the husband and the sons was, I must have been unconsciously searching, scouring the world for a man called George with 3 proto-adolescent sons. They're not that easy to come by.
No, I shouldn't have thought that and you really lucked on the fact that they were in New York as well. So and you happened to be in New York at the same time.
Yeah.
But that makes me think about, you write loving something of where one comes from and having emotional access to that love is a moral imperative for Eliot, where one comes from. And I wonder how much you think about Middlemarch as being a book about Englishness, about being English, about the way in which, in her particular historical moment, 40 years after the moment in which she's writing, whether she was really trying to address something very specific and rather political about English culture specifically. And you know, that's not, I mean, you talk about in My Life in Middlemarch, you talk quite a lot about going back and forth, and actually many of the more poignant sections have to do with your identification with your landscape, and that she would have been very familiar with, but you don't, that's where you come from. And I just wonder how much of your return constantly to Middlemarch has to do with a kind of recognition of a cultural recognition of Englishness.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I you know, there's a whole political subplot in Middlemarch. It's taking place around the time of the Reform Act, and that went on to have ramifications for all of the political unfoldings, and eventually, you know, the spreading of the vote and all of that in England. And that stuff, that part of Middlemarch, is still in many ways very obscure to me. I mean, I don't know, you know, I couldn't give you a long historical answer about the historical context that she was writing about. It's not what I care about the novel. Sure. Although I think, you know, it's probably a deficit in me, and maybe the next time I read it, I'll go back and think more about that. But I think I think that what she was writing about in Middlemarch, but in other books too, is often this erasure or of the rural England that she knew, the England of her childhood, which was already, you know, in the Midlands. She was born in 1819, so when she's living there in the 30s and 40s, it's already being eroded. There are already the railways, and there are already the mills, and things are, you know, she's often conjuring a very recent but dying rural past.
Yes. And she's already nostalgic for that in 1870, because she's in the middle, you know, because the Industrial Revolution is all around her. So how could you not be nostalgic for it?
Yeah.
But also though, I mean, in your own life, the way in which you went to school and left the Midlands and left, you know, a provincial life. I mean, this is in fact in part a result of the sort of changes. I guess I'm asking you too about sort of social change and the ideas of, I mean, meliorist ideas, ideas of progress, and that, you know, one human life can, even in a small way, continue to progress and improve. And you were the beneficiary of some of these social changes that she is
absolutely,
identifying.
No, and I grew up in the south of England, so not the same area, not the same part of England that she did, but very familiar in its, you know, I grew up in a very provincial seaside town, and my brother and I were the first generation in our family to go to university. We were the first generation to last in school longer than the age of 14 or 15, which is how old my parents were when they went, you know, when they left school and went to work. And I was very conscious of my own, you know, me and my brother being able to go so much further and having so many more opportunities. But then, I mean, Middlemarch is also so full of the limitations upon a woman's life. And I think that there was a lot about that still rung true, even though, you know, obviously my life wasn't nearly as limited as Dorothea Brooke's was going to be. But it still felt, you know, in the 80s that it wasn't, you know, being a girl was still, you know, not quite as, I wasn't going to get quite as easy ride as being a boy. I don't know if that's different now.
Right. And also, do you think over time, as you've read it, your identification with the female characters shifts as well? I mean, it seems to me, as I, you know, reading it again now, Eliot is really rather sympathetic in her way to Rosamund Vincy, you know, and in the sense that her her limitations aren't necessarily her fault.
No, they're absolutely
they're
not her fault.
Yeah.
No, I mean she's trivial and stupid, but she's been raised only to be trivial and stupid. I mean her education, the school that she goes to sort of claim its point of pride is that it teaches young women how to get in and out of carriages,
Right.
which incidentally you can learn now if you're practicing to get ready for a wedding. I think that wedding planners will teach you. I wrote a book about weddings, so this is one of the few things I remember about it, but wedding planners teaching young women how to walk backwards in a long gown, which is apparently quite a difficult thing to do. I didn't ever wear a long gown, though, I don't know. But yeah, but I think that, I mean, she has trouble being sympathetic to Rosamond. I still think she finds Rosamond detestable, but she doesn't blame Rosamond for quite how detestable she is. I mean, it's a terribly upsetting thing that, Lydgate, the doctor who marries Rosamond, and she wishes that he wasn't a doctor, essentially. And it's terrible, and you feel with Lydgate because he's the more sympathetic, he's the intellectual, he's the one who has hopes and ambitions. But poor Rosamond is as ill understood by him as he is by her, and I think she makes us absolutely aware of that. And time and again, throughout the novel, we're supposed to see both sides of a problem, and nothing is ever one person's fault.
Right, but also the way in which one's sympathy shifts over time.
Yeah.
I mean, Dorothea, that many of us identified with as a young woman. I mean, she doesn't really knock herself out she's married. It's almost as if she's marrying her education, or at least she imagines she is, instead of going to university or I mean, there must have been books in Mr. Brooks's library that she could have availed herself of.
There's a very good essay by an academic whose name escapes me. It'll come back to me, 3 hours from now. But about this very fact that Dorothea is constantly in the library of either Mr. Brooke or Casaubon, and she's constantly described as sitting there with a book, but she's always staring out of the window, and she can't concentrate on the book, and whatever she does, she goes, and she's constantly she never reads. Dorothea never reads, and this, I wish I could remember her name, but this I'll find it. It's probably in the notes, but she points out, and she's rather skeptical about Dorothea. She doesn't really like her very much, but I think you can. Nina Auerbach. Nina Auerbach. There's a wonderful essay. Yeah, she's somewhere in Pennsylvania. Wonderful essay in a book called Middlemarch in the 21st Century, called Dorothea's Lost Dog. And then she also is unsympathetic towards Dorothea because she doesn't want the little dog that Sir James Chatham tries to give her. But she does make this very persuasive case that, in a way, Dorothea is just as resolutely ignorant as Rosamond. I don't quite buy it, but it's a fun piece to read.
And who else did you find your sympathies changing for so the last reading? Has there been any sort of revelation in terms of a real shift of your sympathies? Because this time going back, I just adore Celia, I must say.
Well, I had a Celia, when I had my son, who's now nearly 9. In the first week after he was born, I wrote to a friend of mine who's an English professor and said, I all these years I thought I was Dorothea, and now I'm Celia, because I was old. So just look at him, isn't he marvelous? Don't you want to spend more time with him? No, I mean Casaubon is repellent when you're younger, and you think that he's awful to be marrying Dorothea, and he should not be. He should know better, which is basically Will Ladislaw's argument. It's much harder when you approach the age that he is, which is he's only about 45. It's really awful. Again, you think he's 70, 90,
He's a death mask with the skin pulled off and all these kinds of things, and he's 45.
He is, and to see his kind of grappling with failure, his knowledge of his own failure, his academic failure, his feeling that he's being judged by this woman that he thought he was going to be helped by, and his terrible realization that he does not have the emotional capacity or depth that he was hoping, that he was sort of saving himself for, and then there's nothing there. I mean, it's terrible to read this, and I mean, you know, George Eliot, when asked who she had based him on, just went, you know, and who, I mean, I would be very skeptical of anybody who would, especially any scholar, who had reached middle age and couldn't see traces of themselves in that character.
And that experience of sort of going down the rabbit hole with some subject that really at the end of the day amounts to a kind of a delusion.
Yeah.
Because there's enough of a quality of that that's necessary for it to have to be present.
Right.
And then you go over on the other side.
Yeah. At one point I thought about, we had a lot of trouble coming up with the title for this book, and one point I thought, I've got it. The Key to My Mythologies. And I suggested this to my editor, and she was like, no. The Key to My Mythologies. It's not bad, right? Anyway, yeah. This is better.
So we all have a bit of Casabon in us. Yeah. Well, you know, you also write that that Eliot could not have written Middlemarch, you say, without her individual contact with sorrow. And you had your own individual contact with sorrow as you were writing the book. Your father died halfway through, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way in which that shifted what it was the way in which you were writing, made the experience and completely opened it out in any kind of way, or changed what it was.
Yeah.
The way in which you were approaching.
Yeah, I mean, I had known that, you know, my father was ill for some years. He had heart problems, and he was declining and sort of fading away. And I had part of the reason, you know, maybe not even fully articulated to myself, but part of the reason why I was writing the book was to go back to England. I mean, literally to go back and see my parents as much as I could in what I knew were going to be his last years. And so when I was writing it, I knew that he would not. I thought it was very unlikely. I mean, I didn't think he would live to see it published, and I didn't even think that he would live long enough for me to finish it. Yeah, he died. It was actually the anniversary of his death a couple of days ago, second anniversary, and he died just as I had finished writing chapter 4. The book is divided into 8 chapters, like Middlemarch is divided into 8 volumes, and I wrote it very much, you know, I wrote it kind of in the shape that you have here. It's not, this first draft wasn't very different from the last. And I was absolutely in the middle of it. And so I'd written these first 4 chapters with the impending sense that, you know, and worry about my father's coming death, and sending chapters of it off to my parents as I wrote them so that they could see what I was doing. There's also a description, I think it's in the 2nd chapter, where I talk about both my parents' parents and my parents living through the Blitz in London. And I wanted them both to read it, both to know that I was writing about them, and to make sure that what I'd written was accurate, so I wanted them to fact check. And so the first half of it was written with this, you know, anxiety and worry, and then the rest of it was written with the knowledge of him being gone. And I knew from the beginning that I was going to end the book, as I do, with talking about Fred and Mary, who are this couple that are in the novel and are betrothed as children and spend their whole lives together. And this was what my parents had done, pretty much. They met when they were 15, and they married when they were 21, and they'd been married for 60 years. They would have been 60 years that year. That was another of the great sort of revelations for me. Reading Middlemarch now, in this stage of life, was to read it, and Fred and Mary, who had been of no interest to me really when I was younger, to look at them and think, oh my goodness, this is my parents, you know. So I knew I was going there. I didn't know, obviously, that I would end up writing my father's death into the book, but I did, and it was written very much in the rawness of that experience, and you know, when those I was already very emotionally open because of writing something that was so personal. So
it's very much present in the prose, that openness, and I think that maybe has something to do with this quality of, I mean, paradoxically, with this quality of the ease or the pleasure with, or the joy in which, you know, you have as a reader that you had as a writer, is that's very much transmitted, and I think that has a lot to do with emotional openness. And you actually talk very movingly, and the research that you did about reading Thorney's letters to George Eliot. I wonder if you could talk about that just for a minute, because that was so affecting and so significant in terms of breaking her in some way open to then the sort of rush of Middlemarch coming right after his death.
Yeah, Thorney was her second stepson, and Thorney was a problem. Thorney was a very ebullient young man who she couldn't really bear having around the house, it turned out, and neither could her husband Lewis, and they didn't know what to do with him, and he eventually went off to Africa, to Natal, to be a colonial adventurer, and he died. He came back to London with some terrible ailment that they couldn't identify what it was, but tuberculosis of the spine, and he ended up dying in her arms after a few months back at home. And I had read a few of his letters in, you know, biographies and this kind of thing, but I went to the Beinecke Library at Yale, where they all are, and read through them all, and he was an absolutely captivating character. I mean, I can understand why you might not want to have him around the whole time in your house, but he was a wonderful writer, very funny, very vivid. I mean, had anybody in that family gone on to be a writer in the next generation, it would have been him. It's Thorney's memoir of George Eliot is the unwritten book I would love to read, you know. But yes, he died while she was in the middle of formulating Middlemarch. She hadn't written very much of it. And I think that the way that the novel looks at the paths of these various young men, there's Fred and there's Will Ladislaw and there's Tertius Lydgate, and they're all trying to figure out what to do with their lives. And she was very much immersed in the world of young men trying to figure out what to do with their lives.
And up to her ears in Boydom, I think.
Up to her ears in Boydom, yeah. And I found this, you know, she's often talked about as a childless writer, and it's so wrong, because if you're a stepmother, you may not have given birth, but you're a parent, absolutely for sure. And I found her struggles with her responsibilities to the children, her love for them, and her resistance to them, all very, very, very interesting and illuminating for Middlemarch, but fascinating for me too, as having, you know, my stepsons are all now in their 20s, but they were, you know, I've been living with them throughout their adolescence, and you know, so to see what Middlemarch could tell me in an oblique way about
sort of working through herself.
About what to do with young men.
Well, I think if we have some members of our Middlemarch reading group who are here this evening, so maybe you brought a question in your mind with you, but we'll throw it open to questions now, I think, if anybody would like to ask one. Yeah, go ahead, James.
Middlemarch is a difficult book. Even for an old guy who's fairly accustomed to reading 19th century prose. And did you read Melinda Henneberger's article in the Post about viewing it?
Yes.
She talks about, as a young woman, reading it for the first time, and I think she's read it 4 times since then. what spoke to even the most gifted 17-year-old? This would seem to be, Middlemarch would seem to be a difficult book for. So what spoke to you, the 17-year-old Rebecca? Was it Dorothea?
It was Dorothea, yes, for sure, because, you know, it was the idea of this heroine who was aspiring incoherently for some more significant life, and I was aspiring in my own incoherent way for doing something other than, I mean, I was reading it as my escape from my provincial home. I wanted to get to Oxford, and that was, I hoped, you know, was going to help me get there. But I also, what also appealed to me about it was its very reputation as one of the pinnacles of English literature, because I wanted to be a well-read person. I wanted to know what that was, and I wanted to be the kind of person that understands Middlemarch. And so it had a kind of, you know, it was a badge of honor too to have read it, and to be able to, you know, perhaps, I don't know, write an essay about it. There was was it Mary Gordon did a piece for the Times a few years ago, for the New York Times, where she talked about there's a certain kind of woman who loves Middlemarch, you know, and yes, I am that kind of woman who loves Middlemarch.
I think we have a few of them here as well. Any other questions?
Is there another book that approximates your passion for Middlemarch?
No. No, I mean, there are lots of books that I love, you know, I mean, I love Daniel Deronda too, but there's nothing that comes close in terms of, you know, revisiting many times. And you know, there are poems and things that I read particular poets that I read when I was young and a student that still kind of linger in the back of my head as references that, you know, come to mind when I'm in certain situations. But no. I think you can only have one, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, you know, unlike love, you can only have one.
But it was also, maybe you could talk just for a second, it was also sort of the key in the lock for you from when you go to your interview for your admission interview for Oxford. You end up talking about Middlemarch.
I did. Yeah, no, I mean, I studied it in order to take these very daunting exams to go to Oxford, and nobody in my family had ever gone to Oxford. Nobody had ever tried, you know, it was just beyond the realm of possibility. My father did well enough in his exams when he was 15 years old to stay on at school, but nobody in his family ever had, and so he couldn't, and he had ambitions that I only learned later to do something other than just become the civil servant that he did, but there wasn't a chance. So this was, I mean, the magnitude of that step for me was, it was like, you know, like the first amphibian coming up out of the water. I mean, it was really like an evolutionary leap, it felt like. And I didn't know when I was reading Middlemarch that I was going to make it, you know, I didn't know if it was going to work. But yes, I went to my interview at Oxford, and I remember it was fearfully cold, and I didn't take my coat off, and I was sort of skinny and huddled in black, and I talked with great enthusiasm, maybe saying even some of the same things as I have done this evening about Middlemarch, and that's what got me in. Yeah. So thanks, George Eliot.
Yeah, exactly.
Because everything else has led from that.
Well, also, you obviously, when you going back to the amount of biography of George Eliot that's in My Life in Middlemarch, talking about her, talk about amphibians leaving the sea, for her to end up and leave Coventry and go and become a journalist in London, living in John Chapman's house with his wife and mistress, and I mean.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, mine was not really an evolutionary leap, although it did feel that way to me, but her transformation of herself from, you know, this clever provincial girl, but not born into an intellectual family. Her father, there's a notebook a diary that her father kept that has been preserved in the library in Nuneaton, And it's very interesting because you look at it and his spelling is not good and his capitalization is wrong, and I mean it's sort of shorthand notes, but then you compare it to George Eliot, and you know, she's so erudite, and I mean even as a young girl, you know, her letters are magnificent, and I mean if priggish, but the language is incredible. So she wasn't born with any expectations, and certainly nobody else in her family stepped away from the local scene, you know, but she made herself with such force. She just built herself out of books, you know, and I so admire it. And I think when I was a teenager, I got hold of the Gordon Haight biography of her, which is the sort of standard scholarly biography, and I think I was so intimidated by her reading of the German Romantics when she was, you know, 12 or something, that I think I'm not sure I even finished that biography back then.
It's like,
yeah.
it's, Emily Dickinson calls those, you know, these 19th century women, right? Lives like loaded guns, you know,
Yeah.
it's just extraordinary. The level of accomplishment is just wait, you know, waiting. It's just, it's mind-boggling, really,
Yeah,
what she was able to accomplish. Any other questions? Well, Rebecca, can I ask you just to read a little bit towards the end again, just so we can hear a little bit of a passage towards the back, because it's really beautiful.
all right, yeah, I'll, okay. This is a little bit from the very end, and it's about it's about the landscape of childhood. We could never have loved the earth so well if we had no childhood in it, Eliot wrote in The Mill on the Floss. We delight in the landscape of our youth because it's imbued with the deepest of memories, she says, and those memories colour our experience of every landscape we enter into thereafter. Our delight in the sunshine on the deep-bladed grass today might be no more than the faint perception of wearied souls if it were not for the sunshine and the grass in the far-off years which still live in us and transform our perception into love. It would be easy at first glance to mistake this for sentimentality, just as it's easy to feel sentimental about the more poetical aspects of one's own childhood. But while Eliot's evocation of the landscape of childhood is alluringly beautiful, it's intensely moving, her use of it is not at all sentimental, if sentimentality is defined as the cheap reliance upon the effectiveness of an appeal to emotion, a reliance that overrules or circumvents the application of critical thought. Eliot's use of childhood landscape is much more complex than that. It's much more rigorous and much more profound. She's not expressing a simple conservative longing for the good old days. The point she is making is that our earliest experiences provide the ground upon which our characters are built, and that some part of our character grows from the brilliant, scintillating, intense capacity for emotion that a child experiences. There's nothing particularly special about the landscape of our youth, she says, except for the important fact that it's where we learned to be human. There is no better reason for preferring this elderberry bush than that it stirs an early memory, that it is no novelty in my life, speaking to me merely through my present sensibilities to form and colour, but the long companion of my existence that wove itself into my joys when my joys were vivid, she writes in The Mill on the Floss. Loving something of where one comes from and having emotional access to that love is a moral imperative for Eliot. It is to be in touch with the kernel of one's character, one's most receptive self. For Eliot, being sensitive to one's memories of childhood is a sign of moral maturity. Being reminded of this is one of the things her books do for me, by connecting me with the child I was before I had ever heard of a writer called George Eliot. In the green fields and shady byways of my youth, Eliot glimpsed the sight of her own youth in imagination, and when I read her books, I am restored anew to that place of childhood. She shows me that the remembrance of a childhood landscape is not mere nostalgia for what is lost and beyond my reach. It does not consist of longing to be back there in the present, or of longing to be a child once more, or of wishing the world would not change. Rather, It is an opportunity to be, it is an opportunity to be in touch again with the intensity and imagination of beginnings. It is a discovery later in life of what remains with me.
Thank you so much. Please thank